Good evening. I'm Attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law. And with me tonight is my co-host, longtime co-host. I think we're doing this for 3 years now, Jane Faherty, who's the director of the Jumpstart program at the Stamford JCC, and she's also an educational advocate. We have two guests tonight, Dr. Michael Cohen, and we'll get into their background and experience in a moment, and Aubrey Schmalle, who's a registered occupational therapist who's licensed to practice here in Connecticut and New York. This evening, we're going to be discussing independent evaluations. I'll give a brief overview of the legal and procedural issues involving independent evaluations. And then we'll turn this over to two evaluators who do independent evaluations, Dr. Cohen and Aubrey Schmalle. Jane and I are continuing our presentation of these Zoom webinars because we are part of a community of concerned parents and professionals. And even though we've been doing this for 3 years, we are still learning how to connect with one another, how to deal with these ongoing challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. We've been moderating a series of webinars to address topics that have occurred in these unprecedented times and try to figure out ways to address the impact upon a child's special education journey. And this, what we have tonight and other evenings webinars, the need is out there and it could be greater. We try to empower those who attend our webinar. The webinar is being recorded. You may have seen a disclaimer. One moment, please. I'm sorry, we were having a little technical problem. There was a disclaimer at the beginning, just to point out this webinar is being recorded. It doesn't establish a professional relationship with Jane, myself, Dr. Cohen, and Aubrey Schmalle. The information is general in nature. We ask that you put your questions. We have many questions that came in prior to this evening's webinar. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A and not the chat feature. Because it's being recorded, anything that's in the chat feature is recorded. What's in the Q&A is not. So we try to maintain privacy, confidentiality. As I mentioned, Jane is the director of Jumpstart and the Stamford JCC, and I'll let her introduce herself. And anything new since we met last month?
Hi, Lawrence. It's great to be here again tonight. It's just been a busy PPT season as we settle back into the new year, as parents are reviewing and assessing their child's progress with data collection, and as school districts continue to struggle providing related services or helping the students work toward goals and objectives, as they quite often are lacking physical resources in terms of personnel in districts. And I know that is a side effect of COVID-19, as well as it's been an exceptionally difficult flu season with RSV. And that is having an impact on all students of all grades in all districts. I don't think anybody has been immune from the lack of resources available, but it still doesn't mean that your child should not be met within district. It's just thinking outside of the box and collaborating and working with professionals such as Dr. Cohen and Aubrey, potentially to maybe fill some of those voids where the districts were unable to. So it's really great to have them here tonight to talk about independent educational evaluations, because they can provide additional pieces of information that you can use and collaborate and share with the district to help them better understand your child and their unique needs, and to help to build the resources and the goals and objectives to meet them where they're at and help them attain mastery, which is obviously the overriding goal. So it's great to have them both here tonight. I think this topic is extremely prevalent amongst all districts. A lot of parents talk about IEEs, but I don't know if they truly understand what an IEE is and how valuable it can be, but also how diverse they really are. So it's great to have them here tonight to be able to answer the questions we've received and others yet to come.
So what we hope to accomplish is to describe, as I said, the procedural and legal requirements behind the IEE. We will have two professional disciplines, occupational therapy and psychology, represented. But as Jane just pointed out, there are many other professional disciplines, speech and language, physical therapy, other areas of need, reading evaluations, auditory evaluations. So we're just touching on two out of several professional disciplines. We'll learn from each of our guests tonight the role of a clinical psychologist, and maybe Dr. Cohen could take a moment to explain the difference between a psychological evaluation and a neuropsychological evaluation. With the occupational therapy, just before this evening, this webinar, we were talking about the myriad of issues that affect a child's sensory regulation. Often we think of occupational therapy as a child having problems with fine motor skills, such as holding a fork or handwriting or keyboarding. And I hope Aubrey will have time to go much deeper than my very brief outline. So without further ado, we will begin tonight's webinar with a brief background. Before I begin, I want to point out that all of our contact information is in the chat section, and as well as, I believe, contact information for the U.S. Department of Education and the State Department of Education. But if it's not there, the U.S. Department of Education is ed.gov, and the State Department of Education is ct.gov. And that will take you to departments and agencies, and you want to click on the State Department of Education. So a lot of our information is based upon, my information, I should say, is based upon resources that are available on either the U.S. Department of Education's website or the Connecticut State Department of Education website. So as I mentioned, the independent evaluation has procedures. If we could have the first slide. And this is based upon federal regulations. The federal regulations are, for those who want to know what they are, they're Title 34 Code of Federal Regulations, and we're in what's called Part 300. I'm not going to go through all of the regulations, just focusing on one or two. Let's see, we're waiting for the slide to come up. Well, while we're waiting for the slide to come up, the whole process starts when a school district completes an evaluation. And typically the evaluation is completed as part of a triennial evaluation, or for those that are starting out in special education, an initial evaluation. There we are. And that is the second. There we are. Okay. Starts as an initial or triennial evaluation. And you'll see in the second bullet point, this is a general overview of the federal regulation 34 CFR 300.304 small b. And those are the regulations that govern the evaluations completed by a school district. They have to be comprehensive. They have to cover all areas of a child's actual or suspected disability. We're trying to get information about developmental, functional, academic information. So sometimes with an initial or triennial, you'll have a school psychologist, a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, a social worker, a physical, occupational physical therapist, speech and language, and other specialties. And all of that's designed to try to get as complete a picture of the child's strengths and those areas of weaknesses that are adversely affecting a child's education. And if a parent disagrees with the evaluation, they have to let the school district know they are disagreeing with the evaluation. And what happens, is parents have to request a publicly funded independent evaluation. There, thank you. Parents have to request a publicly funded independent evaluation. Parents have to make sure that they are disagreeing with an evaluation. They have to request a publicly funded independent evaluation. The school district at that point has to provide the parents with copies of their independent evaluation policies and the criteria they use for outside evaluations. Now, the school district has two choices, not more than two, and sometimes I'm dealing with 3 or 4 choices. The school districts have two choices. They can either agree to fund the request for the independent evaluation, provided the evaluator meets the criteria for outside evaluations, or they have to file a request for a due process hearing against the parents. Next slide. Okay. Now, we have a state Department of Education guidance that's available on the State Department of Education website. And it's about 20 or 30 pages. So the link is, I didn't download it, but there is a link to it on the State Department of Education website. And when a school district denies an evaluation, they have to file a request for a due process hearing against parents within a reasonable period of time. That's not defined, but it's usually within 3 or 4 weeks. The school district would have to demonstrate that their evaluation was completed in conformity with the federal regulations and applicable professional standards. If the school district takes that course of action of requesting a hearing, the parents have to prove that the evaluation did not comply with the federal regulations and professional standards. Now, there are some wrinkles within that, and one of those is what happens when a school district fails to evaluate an area of a suspected disability. We can go next slide. As you'll see in the second bullet point, when the school district did not complete an evaluation but had an opportunity to do so, but for whatever reason did not, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, known as OSEP, has issued a policy letter called Letter to BAUS, B-A-U-S. All of this is available on the U.S. Department of Education's website, ed.gov. And as you can see, when a parent disagrees with an evaluation because the child was not assessed in a particular area, the parents have a right to an independent evaluation to cover that area. So if, say, a school psychologist did some academic testing but not cognitive testing, the parents would have the right to do an independent evaluation in the area of cognitive functioning. As you'll see in the third bullet point, parents, there are some school districts that advise parents you're only entitled to 1 independent evaluation a year. So pick the one that you want. That's not what the regulations say. You have a right to 1 independent evaluation in the area that you're seeking. So it's not 1, pick 1. So if you disagree with a school psychologist, it's a psychological evaluation. If you disagree with the physical therapy evaluation. It's a psychological and a physical therapy evaluation, on and on. And that's in another OSEP letter called Letter to Carol that is also available on the U.S. Department of Education's website. Next slide. The school has to have criterion for the outside evaluation. So if they require the evaluator to have a license from the Department of Public Health or some other criteria, it's perfectly reasonable for the school district to request the credentials of your proposed evaluator. A school district has to consider exceptions to a private evaluator not meeting the criteria, and that's done on a case-by-case basis. In other words, the school district can't say, sorry, the evaluator doesn't meet our criteria. If you can make a compelling case for an exception, they have to consider that. Not in Connecticut, but in other states, sometimes that happens where you have evaluators spread out far and few between, unlike Connecticut, a very small state. And so sometimes if they say you have to be in the county of the school district, but there's an evaluator of the next county over, which in some states, counties are the size of Connecticut. You know, the school has to consider on a case-by-case basis exceptions. And you'll see in the last bullet point on this page, some school districts have cost caps on how much they will pay. I had a case a few years ago where the school district would not pay more than $2,800 for a psychological evaluation. They wouldn't consider any exceptions whatsoever. I do not know any psychologist that will complete an independent evaluation in the tri-state, quad-state area for $2,800. And I asked the school district for an exception, and they said no. So I had filed a complaint with the State Department of Education, and the State Department of Education said you have to consider on a case-by-case basis exceptions to your cost cap. And that's what the State Department of Education said. And you see OSEP has also said that in their 2001 policy letter. Next slide. Okay. One moment, please. So you'll see in the outline here, there are procedures, they must be followed. I have a client right now who asked for an independent evaluation, and that it wasn't because the client disagreed with the evaluation. The parent claimed that the evaluation was never provided by the school district. What happened in that particular situation, and the school district filed for due process. What happened in that particular situation was I didn't think there was a reason to go forward with a due process hearing. The reason being there was no disagreement with the evaluation. The claim was it was never provided. That doesn't provide a reason to go to get an independent evaluation. So at this point, we will shift to our two guests. We have Dr. Michael Cohen, who's a licensed clinical psychologist. He's licensed to practice here in New York. He has these impressive credentials, so I don't want to embarrass him and take time away, but if he wants to embarrass himself, he can talk about his board certifications and his education. And I'd ask him to differentiate between a psychologist and a neuropsychologist. Aubrey Schmalle is a registered occupational therapist who's licensed here in Connecticut and New York. I've had the pleasure of working with both of these evaluators over time and for two different professional disciplines. And I've learned a lot from them directly by speaking to them and more specifically reading their reports. So Audrey will go over her background, her field work, articles that she has published, the type of therapy she provides to children. And I think one of the things I touched upon was sensory-based treatment. So it's not just the mechanics of fine motor, but how the sensory systems that she is trying to access are so important to a child's education. So without further ado, Audrey, you want to go first?
So Dr. Cohen, it's a pleasure to see you again. I will just give Aubrey a moment for her technical glitch. It's fine. And so Dr. Cohen, if you can start by introducing yourself and
Sure.
explaining the differences between some of the evaluations that people might request, but not really truly understand what it is that they're requesting.
So it's both very simple and very complex at the same time. I was originally trained as a school psychologist. I am credentialed through the state of Connecticut Department of Education as a school psychologist, and I received additional training in clinical psychology. So I am also licensed by the Department of Public Health in psychology. I was trained both in schools and in medical centers. And one of the things I bring to my practice is a special focus on young people with complex medical disabilities. I think we have a lot of young people who have a range of different medical needs, from rather more common needs like ADHD to more pervasive and life-threatening medical needs. And they all come to school with different academic needs. And I've also started more recently, we spoke about this previously, and my colleagues and I are speaking about this a lot. We are seeing a lot of children now, young people with more complex emotional and psychiatric needs. And so one of the things that we have to consider when we're doing assessments is what are the psychological needs, what are the emotional needs of the child that we're working with? How does their emotional adjustment affect how they function in school, both as friends and peers, as students to teachers, and as active learners in the classroom? When we talk about psychological evaluations, schools typically have the school psychologist do the psychological portion of the assessment. That is cognitive IQ testing, for lack of a better term. Frequently some adaptive behavior, usually through a rating scale. The most common are the Basques and Briefs. The Connors are out there, but there are a whole bunch of rating scales that we can acquire information about the child. They are typically what they call broadband. A Basque is a wide assessment of different things that a child can have difficulty with or do well. There are specific autism rating scales that look very specifically at autism-specific behaviors. Schools will typically have a academic specialist do the academic portion of the assessment. Schools will typically have a speech and language therapist, pathologist do the language portion of the assessment. We'll have an occupational therapist do both the functional, and Aubrey will talk a little bit more about that, the functional manual motor portions of the assessment. And more we're seeing lots of children with sensory seeking, sensory avoiding issues. And my occupational therapy colleagues will do typically sensory evaluations. We have a child who's just covering their head and ears, trying to avoid all stimuli, or are they bumping into the walls and trying to seek all the stimuli that they can get? When I do an assessment, I consolidate everything. I will consult and speak with colleagues, but I will do most of the assessments. So I'll start with the intellectual assessments. That really is the basis of all additional testing in many ways. Executive function testing. School psychologists are both credentialed and frequently qualified to do executive functioning testing. The example I like to give, in the old days, many of us grew up with a telephone on our wall in the kitchen or on the desk, and the ability to either answer that phone or not answer that phone when we didn't know who was calling. Most of the time we answered that phone. Nowadays, we look and see who is calling on our smartphone, and we decide whether to answer it or not. Those are executive functions. The ability to sit down, get your paper and pencil out, is a planning and executive function. So I look at cognitive executive functions, and we have standard tests to do this. We also have informal qualitative ways of doing it. I look a lot at language functioning. Most neuropsychologists will embed language into the assessment. Now, it's typically not as in-depth as a speech language comprehensive evaluation. And if I see a child has a true receptive or expressive language issue or a pragmatic language issue, I will refer them out to the school district or a colleague. I have worked a lot with kids with auditory processing disorders, and there are ways of looking at auditory processing through neuropsych assessments. And again, if a child shows a auditory issue, you refer them out to the specialist who does auditory processing testing. There are very good assessments for that. I look a lot at memory. Memory is an understated component of learning. If we think of reading, writing, and math, the procedures of reading, writing, and math are all memory procedures. You have to remember what you're learning, otherwise you will not be an efficient learner. Children under the age of maybe 5, 6, 7 acquire information very well. We do not always organize it very well. After about 7, 8, and 9, we expect children to be able to retrieve, organize, retrieve, and utilize information at a high level of ability. The kids I work with who have executive function deficits or attention deficits frequently have difficulty in those areas. We look a lot at attention skills, not just rating scales, which are good secondary sources of information, but we look at primary sources. We give a child an attention test, and we see how she or he or they do on the attention test. And we say, oh, is this normal or is this something different? Are they over-attending and impulsive, or are they under-attending and inattentive? The other thing that we're starting to do a lot in psychology in schools is we're seeing a lot of kids in emotional distress, psychiatric distress. And a standard IQ test doesn't really get to those issues. So we're embedding a lot more of mental health types of assessments into our evaluations. If a child is unhappy, hasn't slept well, if a child is in an environment that is not as attentive at home to his, her, or their needs, this affects their learning. If a parent is having difficulty at work, it can affect a child's learning as well. So we're looking a lot more at emotional needs, especially when we do independent assessments. At least I tend to embed and add in those type of assessments, directly asking the child how he, she, or they are. What are their worries? What are their concerns? And then using some of the well-developed, structured rating scales that we have that are age appropriate. You have to tailor it to the child's age, and interviewing and getting a sense of the mental health needs of that child that you're working with. I do think one of the limitations of schools is it is harder for a school district and for a school psychologist to do that specific type of an assessment within the school setting. For one thing, you are authorized to do different assessments. So if you sit down with your IEP team, they will usually set out the different tests that they will give. They're usually very specific. I have the luxury and the ability and the knowledge to pick and choose and follow what the assessments are showing. So that's really the biggest difference. The difference between a broad-based psychological assessment and a neuropsychological assessment is really the approach of the techniques that you're using to do the assessment. A neuropsych assessment is very much a skills-based assessment. You're looking at other IQ skills, intelligence skills, executive skills, academic achievement skills. Aubrey will talk a little bit more about this. I see a lot of kids who have average to above average language skills, but you put pen to paper and they struggle mightily. So I see a lot of kids with the term is graphomotor, handwriting based impairments. And these are kids that the teacher, especially in the upper grades, is now erasing from the whiteboard, blackboard, or smartboard. And they're still trying to copy down what was written. And now the real problem is they have an anxiety disorder, they're looking around their classmates. If they have a memory disorder, they're trying to remember what the teacher just wrote. And if they have a speed and productivity writing disorder, they can't keep up. So the idea is to sort of match the assessment to what the child's needs are showing. If something unusual or different comes up in the assessment, to follow and to track that. So when I get IEE or school district, general school district assessments, it will be a broad-based assessment we would like a neuropsychological assessment of this child, and I can embed a range of tests. Sometimes I'll go back to the district and say, well, gee, this child is showing a high rate of what looks like depression. I'm asking you to authorize that I put in now a depression or an anxiety assessment into my evaluation. I will always do that if I am seeing it. If it's not authorized and I think it's a worry for the child, I'll convey that worry through my report to the family. And I will frequently put that as a recommendation of mine into my written report. And I'll convey that to the PPT meeting. So I will say if a child is anxious or worried or depressed or agitated or acting out or may have some self-harm issues, the first thing I will do is I'll go back to the district and ask for additional authorization to do that type of assessment. If it's not directly given, I'll speak to the family about how those kind of assessments, whether it's with me or another good professional, can be obtained. And I will always document those worries and concerns into my report, which I will then, hopefully in a timely manner, scheduling permitting, report back to the PPT meeting. The one thing that is becoming a little bit more interesting with IEEs, and Mr. Berliner can correct me if I'm incorrect about this, is lots of times schools are not inviting the evaluator to the PPT to report back on the IEP, to report back on the assessment. And I think it's vital to have the evaluator give the final report to the PPT team. I think it's vital because you have the context. I'm sorry, Mr. Berliner.
That's absolutely correct, because we want you or Aubrey to interpret your evaluation and not to have the school district staff. And that's why it's important to have the evaluator, the PPT.
And let me just add one more quick thing to that. Aubrey or I or other well-trained independent providers, and I'll say the school providers as well, if they have the correct training, know how to administer and interpret a wide range of assessments. But it would be inappropriate for a school district employee, no matter how trained they might be in certain procedures, to report back on a procedure that they've never given or that they're unaware of. Or in fact, I work with some kids with very rare disability presentations. Now they may have given a test and used a test, but they've never given that assessment tool with a child with XYZ presentation and diagnostic criteria. So I think it's absolutely vital that when you get an IEP, to request, in fact, to require the IEE administrator to come and give the PPT report. I mean, there are some things where you can't, but in virtually all cases you can.
But also, not only because you have the skill set that is administered tests and evaluations that the district personnel might not have access to, but presumably then you have additional insight into maybe what support services could and should be embedded in the district to help that child with whatever explicit need that they have, because you have more exposure maybe to different resources across numerous different platforms that maybe the school might not be privy to or not have had experience with this specific type of need that a child has too.
I think that's exactly right. And the ability to advocate for your work product, that is to advocate for the child, is vital. I think that's the core component of the assessment.
So Aubrey, how does that, in terms of, obviously Dr. Cohen is able to cover off a plethora of different evaluations. So the neuropsych, the psych exam, mental health assessments, which can help not only the parents tease out what the child's needs are and parlay that to the district, but in terms of OT, which is another separate area, because quite often parents will say, I want an IEE, but they don't necessarily know what it is that they're requesting. Yeah. If they were to request an OT evaluation, can you describe the different types of evaluations that potentially could come under that umbrella?
So I think, like Mr. Berliner said before, it's very, I think a lot of people misunderstand or understand OT in a very narrow way, when really there happens to be a lot of overlap when I work with Dr. Cohen in a lot of these regulation and anxiety issues, as they relate to an ability to actually demonstrate what kids can do in school and their ability to function within the classroom setting. So when the type of evaluation that I do is much, much bigger than what you typically get at the school-based level. So often, not in every district, but in a lot of districts, the evaluation that I see for OT is like parent and teacher rating forms around sensory processing. So not really directly assessing sensory processing abilities, but rather what someone's perception or interpretation is of the child's behavior. And then the second piece is that they've done what's called the VMI, which is a standardized test that is drawing based. It is not writing based. And from there, and doing a few other maybe fine motor observations or observations within the classroom about their posture or their typing skills on the computer. But very often they do not actually do a more in-depth graphomotor assessment to really look at writing separate from visual motor. Visual motor and drawing skills are just one very small component of the total picture of writing. And so when I think about sensory integration, and this is a very different definition than what people traditionally think about in the school setting, is sensory integration is how a person takes in and processes information from their environment and from their body so that they can adapt and respond to whatever is going on, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's in the home setting or out in the community at summer camp. But specifically for an IEE, we're really looking at a child's ability to adapt to the demands within the school environment. You know, do they have the body skills to sit down in their desks to do their work? Do they have something going on with their vision that makes it very hard for them to sustain focus and pay attention? Do they have something going on with their body where it's physically painful for them to write? Or do they have something maybe going on at a higher level where their visual perceptual skills that are off and the way that they're interpreting information that's coming in is inaccurate? And we don't know any of those answers without doing a more in-depth evaluation. And a rating scale by a parent or a teacher is not going to tell me how those sensory systems are working and how the child is really using them to help themselves adapt and respond. So some kids really need very fast movement to get alert and connected to their bodies. Other kids are so anxious that they need a lot of rhythm and pressure and breathing to help themselves calm down. But I can't figure out what those elements are unless I am really taking an in-depth look at the sensory systems, as well as doing standardized testing around their gross motor skills, their fine motor skills, their postural control, their visual skills, their handwriting and graphomotor skills, their typing skills. So we're talking a very, very lengthy evaluation compared to what many OTs traditionally are able to do in the school setting, because I want to understand also what's not in the OT domain. You can have a self-regulation issue that can be triggered by a very specific learning disability, but some of the strategies you might be using are physiological and sensory based, and other strategies are direct intervention around the learning disability. So as much as my job is to figure out what the OT pieces of the puzzle are, the other piece is to really say, no, this dysregulation is not specifically coming from a sensory sensitivity or an overwhelm in the environment. I think it's being triggered by the learning demand itself, and those layers need to be better, teased out and understood, because sometimes people do assume that the dysregulation is sensory oriented when there may be some other pieces to the puzzle as well.
Can I just add one quick thing to what Aubrey said? I think there are lots of reasons why this has happened. We're seeing right now in evaluations an overabundance and I think overuse of rating scales. So I will get a school district evaluation where maybe 4 years ago I would have had 1 or 2 rating scales perhaps. Now I'm seeing rating scales, I'm getting assessments with 3 to 5 rating scales, and they frequently overlap, not always, but they frequently overlap what the questions are. So if you receive an OT sensory rating scale, that will be different than a psychology rating scale. But if you're getting a brief and a BASC and a Connors in my field, they tend to overlap enough that it becomes sort of redundant to do them all. And I think a lot of times they're used instead of just asking a basic question. How is your child doing? Where's your student having his or her difficulties? And I think we substitute that. Now, sometimes you will need 2 rating scales. A Vineland is needed if you're looking at an intellectual disability. But if you're looking at an ADHD type disorder, we have very good assessments that are hands-on that tell us much more information, as Aubrey alluded to.
We had a quick question, and this is for Aubrey. Are there any tests that you would recommend for assessing visual perception skills?
So my strategy is to try to use ones that are different from what the district are using, and sort of the gold standard inside the district is the VMI, but there are much more expansive tests out there. There is the test of visual perceptual skills, and its partner, the test of visual motor skills. That one is only looking at visual perception, the other is only looking at motor. Some districts are using the DVTP3. That's the developmental visual, wait, DTV, the test of visual perception, DTVP. And that is a combination of visual motor and visual perceptual testing. Both of those are much more comprehensive because visual perceptual testing is actually, there's many aspects to visual perception, and you can be fine in one area and not fine in another area. The VMI only assesses one type of visual perception, and one of the challenges that I have with it is that just by the way that the test is set up, on the second page, all of the images get very small. So if you have an ocular motor issue and your eyes actually have trouble focusing on things, it's much more likely that you might present with a visual perceptual issue when in point of fact it's an ocular motor issue and you need a different type of intervention. And one thing I don't see a lot in the school-based evaluations is a look at these ocular motor issues that are actually occurring quite frequently in this generation of kids who are spending a lot of time on the computer. They're getting vision issues at much younger ages, and their skills are not developing in the same way that they used to. So it's a very critical area, especially for children on the spectrum. I see it very often, and there is actually a lot you can do to enhance a child's ability to use their eyes so that they work for them. So if anything, I know somebody else was asking, if there's no academic impact, how can I get the school to approve an OT evaluation? There may actually be an impact. It might just not be in the written work that they're turning in, but it doesn't mean that it's not in attention, it's not in regulation and focus, it's not in sustained effort in independent work. All of those would also be behavioral reasons that you might refer for a sensory-based OT evaluation.
Now, the comment on the ocular motor, I don't know what anybody else's experience is, but mine is almost universal when a parent comes in with a developmental optician or ophthalmologist evaluation who's recommending the training of eye muscles, and the schools are often very dismissive of that. And you're pointing out the reasons, especially with this newest generation who's tethered to their electronics, the importance of that. So I'm glad you brought that out.
Yeah, and the research is actually showing, and they are specifically stating that it is a concern specifically as it relates to learning, not a separate medical issue that should just be dealt with medically.
Yeah.
And even there, if it is a medical issue that affects learning, that's why we have the classification of other health impaired.
So
Mhm.
to answer a question we had, where do you go for this testing? So both Dr. Cohen and Aubrey have their own private practices, and they both administer the plethora of evaluations based upon the specific and bespoke needs of your child. So they would meet with you, understand your concerns and the child before they then decided which evaluations to complete. But both Dr. Cohen and Aubrey and Sensational Achievements do provide these evaluations. So I'd recommend, if you want further advice from them after, you can contact them privately. I'm sure that they'd be very willing and happy to talk to you and find out whether they could complete these with your child or not. And if they couldn't, they're great. They would point you in a different direction. But
And I would just add, at least in psychology, there are lots of exceptionally good private practice psychologists here in Connecticut. And people like Mr. Berliner know a lot of the psychologists. If a child has a slightly different need that I usually take care of, I know a lot of colleagues I can always refer to.
I see a couple of questions in the chat. What is a functional vision assessment? That is actually, there's a difference between seeing clearly, which requires you to have glasses, so because things look fuzzy, and how your eye muscles are working together to be able to shift your attention, to be able to focus on things that are moving around you, to be able to focus on something coming towards you, or sustain focus like on a book or a computer. And looking at how your eye muscles are moving, which can be done through a vision screening. And now there's actually a very short visual skills assessment that is standardized, which is great for me. And I've added it to my evaluation list. You can actually get comparison to sample and the rest of the population to see where they fall, in that normative range. And now I actually have the ability to report some of those scores. So that's great. I'm looking, couple other questions for schools that say that they don't work on sensory if there's behaviors present. That's actually a big concern. That is a reason to seek out a sensory-based IEE, because the question is, where are these behaviors coming from? A lot of children get self-preservation is number one. Social rules are not as important if I am feeling physically uncomfortable in the environment or the demands are overwhelming to me. And if you don't understand that, I do see a lot of kids that get put, interestingly, in behavior-based outplacements or specific classrooms for behavior. And it turns out when I see them, their eyes don't work for them. They have auditory sensitivity. They maybe even have a suspected auditory processing deficit. So imagine being in a room where everything just is garbled. I can't see clearly. I can't understand what in the world you're saying to me. Why would I pay attention? I'm going to react to get out of the situation because the world doesn't make sense. And that's really I think the most valuable thing that I can bring to the table is, if the world is not making sense to your child, then we need a plan on how to address some of those gaps. And this is more than just a sensory diet. This is not just to help your child wake up or calm down. This is how to help your child understand the world that's coming to them so that they can actually be active learners.
So I have a question.
I was going to just add, there's some comments on some different types of techniques. Broadly defined, I'll use the term neurofeedback. It is a technique that can certainly help some young people, adults as well, with attention and focus. There's some research that looks at and can help with emotional adjustments and emotional regulation. The important thing that I think Aubrey has also touched on is linking the assessment to both the disability and the intervention. We can give all of these tests and we can get all this great information, but it has to be useful to this child. It has to be useful to the classroom teacher and to the school team. And if it isn't, it's just nice information. And we really have to figure out, what is it when we say a child has a visual motor impairment or a child has an anxiety disorder? How do we link that with these assessments that we gave? And how do we then translate that to say, these are the best practices that can promote this student's educational welfare in this school or potentially in another school. So that's really the vital thing that we always have to come back and think about. What are the interventions that we're going to develop, and how we're going to actualize these interventions for this specific child or this specific classroom. When we do tests, sometimes we think, oh, the test is very child specific. Well, maybe we have an intervention that will be good for the community of learners as well, the community of the classroom. So we always think of those issues as well. So that's really the vital part of testing, is how do you link it to what you're going to do afterwards?
Well,
Yeah.
and I think, sorry, go ahead, Jane.
I was going to say this links into a question that we were asked before the webinar for both Lawrence and either of our guests. What if the resources, having done the evaluation, we understand the child has a complex need, how then, but the way in which to address the need is not provided within that specific school or that specific district or classroom? What then should the parents do to help make sure that that need is addressed within that specific school system? And that's to Lawrence as well.
Well, from
I'll
my
give you a psychology answer.
Ask, you know, that's you have to make your needs known. You have to make the requests known, and that's the starting point. And then you get to Dr. Cohen, Aubrey, Schmalle, you know, the more you get into the fine line details, but a lot of parents sit at these meetings and not, you know, they're very intimidating when you go into these meetings online or in person. There's 12 staff members and one parent, and they all know what they're talking about, and the parent doesn't. So knowing your rights, understanding, you know, your child's needs, and I give a lot of credit. I give PhDs in clinical parenting to all of my clients because they're experts on their children. But the problem is they sometimes are not able to articulate or advocate in a very large meeting. So it's very important that parents know their rights, know their child, know what they're asking for. And some of the questions we have is, where do we get this information? Well, the starting point is the school district is supposed to evaluate all areas of a suspected or actual disability. That's the starting point. And where we get to where we are this evening, when there's a disagreement, parents have a right to a publicly funded independent evaluation. And the school district has two choices, not three. They can say yes or no. And if they say no, they have to take the parent to a due process hearing. And one of the questions that came in tonight was the parents, I keep asking for an independent evaluation and it's denied. When can I ask for the next one? Well, the school district right then and there needs to file for due process. They can't string the parent along. And that's where sometimes filing a complaint with the state Department of Education, called the CRP, Complaint Resolution Procedure Complaint, will get the State Department of Education involved, and they'll direct the school district to do what they're supposed to if they find a violation of the student's rights and the family's rights. So these are very, very important rights. It's a very powerful tool for parents to have a right to a publicly funded, and I'll just digress one more moment. One person said, do these evaluators accept Husky or other insurance? It doesn't matter. You're asking the school district to pay for it. These are publicly funded independent evaluations. So if you are doing this privately, private insurance, Husky is a concern, but you want the school district to contract with the private evaluator and pay for the evaluation, and hopefully pay for the evaluator to come to the PPT meeting to discuss the report.
And I'll just add, even before IEEs, frequently with some of our very complex students who are out there, I get school districts contacting me saying, we have this young person that we're not quite sure how to help. Can you do the evaluation for us? And that's even a step before it gets to the point where you have to even ask for an IEE. Is sometimes if you speak with a advocate or Mr. Berliner, and you know the questions to ask, and you can say, well, let's avoid all of this. Let's see if we can get it done the first time around without having to go through the whole process of an IEE. And so I get called lots of times, I think Aubrey does as well, to do assessments in advance of any sort of conflictual relationship. And if you can avoid it and do it that way, that's always the best.
We have a question. Are evaluations in other languages besides English? I have seen Spanish language psychological evaluation, but I don't know about any other professional discipline. And I don't know if there are any other languages besides English and Spanish. Could either of you answer that?
I can. I have used, it's always best to get the child's home language when you can with the evaluator. That is not always possible. I almost had to fly in a translator from California once. But I do use appropriate translation services that is legal, and under the right circumstances, it is legal and ethical. And so if you have a young person who has a language that is not common in the school district, you can ask to have a translator, both either assisting the school psychologist, or if you go the private route, assisting the private practice provider as well. We have one advantage: we're reasonably close to Boston, New York City, that we can get a wide range of linguistic evaluators. And there are professional language translation services. So that is, if you can find an evaluator in the child's home language, it's always best. But a translated evaluation is a reasonable, ethical, and legal request.
And a necessity, understandably, if a child doesn't understand what's happening in the world around them because they can't access it linguistically, how can we expect to understand what the child's needs are? So the communication has to be, you know, in both directions. And I've attended PPT meetings where we've requested translators, and the district, despite having 92 languages in their district, do not have access to translators in whatever particular dialect it might be that this family or this child is their first means of communication. And that in and of itself, as you both know, can cause dysregulation and confusion and anxiety for a child when they don't understand even auditorily what's happening around them, and then can't communicate or express or connect with what's presented in front of them.
We had a question, does the school district have to accept the results of the independent evaluation? And that's a very interesting and important question. The federal regulations only say the school district has to, quote, consider the evaluations. So the question is, what does consider mean? Does it go in one ear and out the other? Or does it go in one ear and stop in the middle, meaning in the brain and its process? I don't have the answer. It's on a case-by-case basis. Some school districts say that's very nice, we'll put it in the child's educational records, and other school districts will say, gee, we didn't know this about the child and we're going to revise the IEP. So I don't have a definitive answer. I don't know if Jane or Dr. Cohen or Aubrey have different experiences.
My experience is everyone collaborates differently. And there are sometimes you go in the room and they've already decided that they know what the plan should be, and other times they're very appreciative of the additional information. I've had OTs that are super collaborative. Sometimes it's actually the speech therapist or the reading specialist that's super collaborative with me. So I try to pay attention to who seems to be the most interested person in the room, and then try to speak into that, because I've actually had reading specialists and speech therapists come up to me and say, tell me what I should do in my sessions, but maybe not the same experience with the occupational therapist who was on that same team. And it can change from year to year, and it can change within the year if some of the providers on the team change as well, I think.
I agree with Aubrey. I was just going to say, I agree with Aubrey. That's been my experience. Some of the educators around the table are really looking for information, and they want to know how to connect with a child. And when their own team can't provide it, they are really seeking it from external sources. If other PPT meetings, sometimes the ego of the evaluator that's maybe been in the district interferes with your ability to, at that moment in time, share the information. But sometimes if you're able to have conversations outside of a Zoom context, privately, it does help to build that relationship and that collaboration.
Mhm.
I was gonna say, sometimes I feel like a diplomat and that we should have been trained in diplomacy. But in reality, one of the key indicators is if I'm not being invited to the meeting, that's a good indicator of where the considerations that I think are valid will be considered. Frequently, I'll have conversations with either the school psychologist ahead of time, or I'll have conversations with the director of special ed ahead of time saying, look, these are the things I'm going to recommend. You might agree with some of them. You might not agree with some of them, but these are how I'm going to recommend it. This is my responsibility to this child. The other thing I'll say is if someone has a better, more reasonable way of doing something, absolutely. These are just recommendations, and we're always interested in best practices and the best way of helping a child. So if you present something that triggers a great idea from a colleague, perfect. That's exactly what we're supposed to be doing.
Mhm. Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, I often try to widen the conversation, and not specifically always talk to the OT. I saw a question earlier in the chat talking about, you know, if there are visual issues or auditory issues, thinking about dyslexia, dysgraphia as a processing deficit. If you consider sensory integration as the way that your brain and body is taking in and organizing information, then yes, this is all the way that the nervous system and the brain and the body are processing information. And that goes into the output, whether that impacts reading or it impacts writing skills. But then in terms of intervention at school, they might not call it a sensory issue because you might not be getting a traditional sensory diet, but you might be getting multi-sensory strategies and specific exercises that are known to work very well with that particular population. So for example, they've done research that improving hand-eye coordination actually improves lexical decision-making for dyslexia. So why wouldn't you do a brain-body connection recommendation in my report, you know, that says, okay, a child could benefit from this type of movement in support of their particular disability. And in that regard, sometimes I will catch the ear of the reading specialist, or if I bring up something going on auditorily and I say, okay, I think this might be more in the auditory processing domain, not in the sensory overwhelm kind of domain, but they're getting overwhelmed by a whole bunch of people talking because the language is overwhelming. So let's talk about that and let's go in that direction. So whoever can hear the information, I think sometimes even saying or not always using the word sensory for me comes in handy to actually explain that it's integral to the different pieces that the other disciplines are working on.
And I think what Aubrey just said is you have to know the consumer of who you're speaking to. Who's the consumer of our work product? The consumer is the parent. In some cases, it's the parent's advocate and attorney. In virtually all cases, it is the school providers. And there's a chat comment, are we predetermining? I'm not sure if that was intended to us as providers. We are expected, when we can, to make a reasonable set of recommendations. There are some times that we can't, we're at a loss as well. But in most cases, we're expected to make a reasonable set of recommendations to advance the student. That's not predetermining. We give these reasonable recommendations to the PPT. We participate in the conversation of the PPT, and we say, how can we best solve this child's learning needs through the PPT? Sometimes, and very frequently, we'll go to the PPTs and you'll get answer A during the meeting. But in reality, the good attorneys who are both working for the school district and for the families will negotiate a reasonable solution after the PPT meeting. So that's something that I think families always have to remember is there's sometimes an immediate public answer, but frequently there is a reasoned legal answer that will come afterwards. And we sort of help assist that the best we can as well.
Yeah, all of this is designed to ensure that a child's receiving a free, appropriate public education. So this is just one slice of the larger pie. We want to make sure that IEPs are based on the most up-to-date information, comprehensive evaluations of the child's actual or suspected disability. And we're identifying those areas, whatever that area is, sensory, psychological, physical therapy, emotional, whatever that's getting in the way of that child's ability to succeed in school. And ultimately, parents can request a due process hearing if there's a denial of a free, appropriate public education. I have mentioned several times this evening that a school district can also request a due process hearing and they're required to, I should add, when they deny a parent's request for an independent evaluation. Due process hearings are administrative trials. It's an adversarial process where each side has to put on their case. The school districts almost always have an attorney and a law firm on their side, and it's always advisable for parents to do likewise. But there are costs involved, financial costs, emotional costs, other costs involved, and sometimes parents go to hearings and without an attorney, and they tend to lose. Doesn't mean they're going to win with an attorney, but an attorney can advise a parent, as I did last week. There's no reason to go to a due process hearing. The facts don't support the request for an IEE, so it's my professional advice to withdraw the request. That's what I had advised a client of mine. Other clients, sign me up, we'll go to the hearing. And Dr. Cohen talked about communication, and I want to point out communication is a two-way street. It's not a monologue. The back and forth is very important. Developing and cultivating relationships. As you heard Aubrey talk about, maybe there's somebody in the room that's actually listening to me. You want to speak to that person. You want to have informal ways of meeting with the school, monthly informal meetings, non-PPT meetings. Sometimes those informal meetings head off the formal PPT meeting, and sometimes head off going to a due process hearing. And I can't stress enough that communication is a two-way street, and parents should, if they don't understand something, they need to ask. There should not be a condescending attitude where the evaluator, the school district said, well, you should know what I'm talking about. Explain it to me. Because I know when I'm dealing with all the evaluators the private evaluators that I deal with, they have a briefing session, a debriefing session with the family to go over those results. And if there's any ambiguity, if there's any misunderstanding, let's get it worked out now, because once we release that report to the school in final form, unfortunately, that's the report that the parents are going to advocate for, and we want to make sure they understand what they're advocating for. All of this is designed to ensure the student is receiving a free, appropriate public education.
Let me just add one really important thing. I was working with a young person, and the PPT was, for a whole host of reasons, delayed. In the interim, the child had some psychiatric issues. And so my report said, we made certain school placement recommendations. I actually ended up, based on the child's psychiatric needs, subsequently changing, in some cases, my recommendations. And the school said, well, but you wrote this, but the answer is, I wrote that 3 months ago. And the child's needs in this short period of time changed substantially enough to let us consider now these other alternate ways of thinking about the child. So you have to have a little bit, what Mr. Berliner says correct. Once we submit a report, that is the report. But at the same time, as the child's circumstances might have changed a lot, we have to have some level of flexibility to address those needs.
Yeah, and just as the child is evolving and changing, and that could be day to day, week by week, month by month, it doesn't, sometimes school districts say, well, this is what we've always used. This is our program that we have. And you can challenge them and say, well, my child's not a static being, and neither are the resources that you should be applying to my child, because there's so many more resources out there that some districts have access to, and others might not be even aware that these other programs exist. So I was at a PPT the other week and I mentioned Edmark and I mentioned a LAMP communication system. And the response was, well, what's that? And I explained it to them. And once they understood, they're like, oh, maybe this would be good for this student and this student. The fact that they weren't opposing, they were just unaware that there were other means by which to help children access resources. So someone like Dr. Cohen and Aubrey, they are great resources, not just for your child, but for districts to understand other things that might be available to help your child, and therefore, as Dr. Cohen alluded earlier, to help other children as well. It's the sharing of information, and it's how you share that information that hopefully will turn the key to the IEP and creating appropriate, and as Lawrence always says, it's the appropriate which is important, not just having access to the resource, but is it the appropriate resource that we're providing the children access to?
Well, it's getting late. Sorry, try to get as many questions as we could this evening. I'm sorry we couldn't get to each and every question. I want to thank Dr. Cohen and Aubrey Schmalle for their time. I want to thank for everybody who's been with us throughout the evening for your time as well. We will continue our Zoom webinars through the rest of the school year. Jane and I have not finalize a date or a topic, but we'll try to have one in the month of March. So I want to thank everybody for their time and attention. I also want to thank my daughter, who's off to my right, who's doing all the technical stuff behind the scenes, both tonight and setting up this each and every, not this one, each and every webinar, and we could not do it without my daughter Rachel's yeoman effort behind the scenes. So Jane, I sign off to you and then let Dr. Cohen and Aubrey give some concluding and final remarks.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and particularly Aubrey and Dr. Cohen. And I know that we sometimes have professionals watching this webinar as well as parents. Aubrey, I can attest that with the team and the teaching staff that I work with at Jumpstart at the JCC, we have invited Aubrey, and we could invite Dr. Cohen to come along and give training session, because the more professionals that understand some of these needs and techniques that are available to children, the more that we can help support them as professionals, not only within our classrooms, but within other classrooms. So as well as reaching out to these organizations for your support for your child, if you're professional, you can also reach out to these other professionals to give you insight and understanding in terms of how to support the parents and help them support their children. So I think these are both incredible community resources that don't hesitate to reach out to for advice for yourself, your child, or your colleagues, if that's your situation. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Cohen or Aubrey, any concluding remarks?
Yes, thank you. I definitely am seeing questions in the chat, questions in the Q&A. I'm trying to answer some, but I know I can't get to everything. Please, feel free to shoot me an email. You can also, I do little free 15-minute chats if you need it. If you need to ask a question, problem solve through something. There's also some very useful parent resources on my other website, bodyactivatedlearning.com, if you're looking for resources to kind of get you started in the world of sensory diet and self-regulation types of things, just to learn a little bit more. So there's a lot out there. I think if you're here and you're asking questions, that says a lot already, that you want to try to understand a little bit more and do the best for your child.
And I would just like to thank Mr. Berliner and Jane and Aubrey. This is, I always learn something when I meet with them, so it's always great for me. Aubrey's websites are superb, and they're really great resources. And I think we are very lucky here in Connecticut. We have a lot of very good resources, public resources, private resources, and the thing I always tell families to do is reach out, make a phone call. And the best way of finding out information is, be careful on the internet, but there are lots of good internet sources, but reach out and call a professional. And most of us will spend a few minutes and say, this is an issue that we're happy to help you with, or we can point you in the right direction. And there really are a lot of good resources, both within your children's schools and within our general Connecticut community. So again, thank you so much for inviting me.
And lastly, I just want to say, everybody who's registered will receive a copy of tonight's webinar. There were several questions on that. And all of our contact information is at the beginning of the chat feature, Dr. Cohen, Aubrey Schmalle, Jane, and myself. So with that, I want to thank you. Stay healthy, safe, and Jane and I will see you next month.
Thank you, everyone.